We're really excited to have all of you all here today. And please feel free to continue to introduce yourselves in the chat to the fellow creatives and artists here, as well as to our panelists. I'm really excited, as I said, to have you all for the second day of our Arts Alliance Help Desk workshop series for creative nonprofits, all about sustaining and adapting your organization. We're gonna go over a couple Zoom housekeeping things, and before we get into the program, share a little bit about the plan for today. But I want to make sure that you all know that we have ASL interpretation here today. So I'm going to go ahead and spotlight our interpreters. If for some reason you can't see them, please use the three dots in the upper right-hand corner of their video screen to pin them as needed. This program today has been made possible with support from the Illinois Department of Commerce and Economic Development. It was really designed to help the creative sector get established, expand, and thrive. And we've been hosting these workshops throughout the whole summer. Our past webinars in this series you can view on the Arts Alliance YouTube channel, and I'll go ahead and drop a link to the chat in that in just a couple minutes. Here is our plan for today. We are going to go over a brief overview for those of you who don't know much about Arts Alliance. Maybe it's your first program, a little bit about our work. And then we have two experts here from BDO about best practices and tools that arts organizations can use to build operating reserves. And there's some interaction, so get ready for that, as well as some time at the end for Q&A. We really want to encourage you to use the chat and the Q&A throughout. We want to hear from you about what the questions you have are, where the places you need clarification. So we're really looking forward to this being an interactive conversation. Before we get to those presentations, though, I do just want to give you all a little overview of Arts Alliance, again, especially for folks who are coming to our program for the first time. So we are a statewide advocacy organization working to build the creative sector's power through advocacy, policy change, and connection to resources to improve the quality of life for communities across Illinois. Our members and our networks span all art disciplines across the state, and our membership is pay what you can. So I'll drop a link if you're interested in becoming an Arts Alliance member in just a minute. Arts Alliance really focuses our work in four main areas: civic engagement that centers artists and the creative sector, policy organizing and structural change to help the creative sector advocate for our interests, research to collect and disseminate data that the sector needs for advocacy and building public will for the arts, and resource navigation to help the sector connect with public funding dollars. And that's where the help desk comes in. From fighting for and winning COVID relief funding for the arts to helping creatives navigate public funding, Arts Alliance is here to make sure that the institutions and the individuals in the arts and culture sector can thrive. And in particular, our help desk, which is putting on this program, is here to support you and connect you with resources. So on our site, you can connect with a staff member who can help you identify opportunities to resource your creative venture. You can see our running list of public funding opportunities and get that critical technical support to successfully apply for public funds. We know that creatives in downstate Illinois and in the south and west sides of Chicago often face disproportionate barriers to accessing the resources they need. And that's why we're here to connect you with the experts and Illinois' creative community to make sure that all of us can thrive. As I mentioned, today is our last in this series of workshops for creatives, but we have a lot of great resources, again, on our help desk page. We will be having this recording available on our YouTube shortly, including webinars that are sort of split between focusing on creative nonprofits and on creative business owners. But regardless of whether our webinar is sort of targeted towards one of those parts of the creative community, there really is something for everyone in all of our programming. So thank you all so much for being here today. I'm really excited about this program and this conversation we're going to have. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to our wonderful experts at BDO.
Thanks so much, Jess. All right, let me share my screen. Katrina, can you give me a thumbs up if you see that? Thanks. So wonderful to be here with you all. I am based in DC, so I'm not in Illinois, but my parents met in Chicago, so my existence is owed to the state of Illinois. And I also am an arts lover. I'm a harpist myself. I was a theater kid, so always excited when I get to work with arts organizations and be with you. I'm a director with BDO in our nonprofit and grantmaker advisory group. I think many of you have attended these trainings as just described. So I don't know how much BDO introduction is necessary, but I'll give you just a little bit. So BDO is a large accounting firm. Katrina and I work with this small group that just works with nonprofits and grant makers. And our focus is around financial management and operational excellence for nonprofits and funders. So we do that through a lot of different ways. We do trainings, we do direct consulting work. Part of my job is acting as an interim CFO for a nonprofit. So a lot of different ways that we support organizations in thinking about financial management. And we work from really small nonprofits to really big, complex international organizations. So a lot of experience there we can draw on. Excited to be with you, and I will let Katrina introduce herself before I continue on.
Hi all, thanks so much for having us. I'm Katrina Venturina. I'm calling in from New York, but similar to Flannery, Chicago, Illinois holds a really dear place in my heart with a lot of friends and colleagues that are out there, specifically in Chicago. So I too am an artist at heart. It's in my soul. I trained as a violist and violinist for a significant period of my life, and I work a lot with arts organizations in the work that we do, specifically with really large initiatives with some of our funder partners. So always excited to be speaking with the sector and learning from all of you and working in partnership.
I didn't realize that you were also a musician, Katrina. We have to start a little BDO orchestra.
So here for that.
Okay. So what we plan on talking through today, we are going to really dig into this concept of operating reserves, which is one of these sort of loaded terms where there's a lot of what does that mean? And so we're going to dig into some of the technical terminology behind it, and then really then shift to how do we think about what we should have in terms of operating reserves as an organization, and then shift to how do we build that? And then how do we manage that? How do we think about the governance that goes around those operating reserves? So that's the focus for today. As Jess said, this is a webinar. We want it to be as interactive as possible. We actually are going to have 2 breaks for questions. So at the end, as Jess said, we'll have another one in the middle. So if you have questions, put them right in the chat when they pop up, and we'll be sure to get to them in one of those 2 question breaks. I know it's hard to sort of remember in the moment or later. So ask them in the moment while they're fresh in your head. We have time to ask those. And we'll have a couple of polls, so please also respond to those. So want to just ground ourselves, like I said, in what operating reserves are. And before we do that, we really wanted to just sort of ground a little bit in what we see as sort of financially resilient organization practices. So if you've been in one of our trainings before, you've probably seen some of this. Sometimes we share a whole infographic with all the practices and values and things that are a piece of financially resilient organizations. But we see a few things as being really key, and operating reserves sort of relate to all of these. So one thing that we see in financially resilient organizations is that they're focused on the long term, right? They don't just have a view of what does the next year look like, what do the next 6 months look like, but they're really thinking long term about what do they need as an organization. And operating reserves are critical to that because ultimately operating reserves are, the squirreled nuts that we're sort of keeping, away for winter for some, future need that we're not totally sure what it is yet. And so we're thinking we want to have this sort of security for the long term and putting that aside. So that's sort of how we think about our sort of operating reserves in a long-term context. But at the same time, financially resilient organizations are also going to be responding to current needs, right? They're going to be understanding, what do we need in terms of our, staff needs today, really responsive to that. And so there's a bit of balancing between being responsive and reactive to current needs, but again, focused on that long term. And operating reserves, again, should be based and built upon sort of what do we need as an organization? How are we growing? How are we contracting? What is, sort of our operational needs? And so we'll dig into that. And then the last practice that we see that we wanted to highlight is being able to tell our financial story and really understand our financial story. And when we say financial story, sounds a little bit, hokey, but the thinking there is, are we able to look at the numbers in our financial statements and then tell the narrative behind that, right? If we've had a year where we had really challenging financial circumstances, are we able to sort of tell that story from the finances? And when I think about this in an operating reserves context, are we able to share with stakeholders why we want to build operating reserves? Might be something to think about. Are we able to share with stakeholders why we have operating reserves, right? Can we tell our funders why it's important for us to build this? So that's the piece that I would think about today is how am I able to tell that financial story of either our goal of setting them up or managing them, whatever that might be, to really connect the numbers to the story and our mission. So when I hear the word operating reserves from clients, I always need to do a bit of digging about what they mean by it. And sometimes you see all these bubbles here, I hear these different words, and I always need to understand sort of what's behind and what's going on. So some of the things that we often hear that can be synonymous, but aren't necessarily synonymous with operating reserves are things like a rainy day fund, our emergency cushion. Maybe we talk about having an internal line of credit. We have cash reserves. Maybe we have a board designated fund. Maybe we have something that we call an endowment. We're not really sure if it's a real endowment or if it's a quasi endowment, right? So there's all these different words that maybe are thrown out by board members, by our team, by funders, and we need to dig in and understand what they are. So the first few slides I'm going to walk through are a bit of just laying the land of some definitions for what these are. And then we'll dig into the more practical side of it, which is how much should we have? And then we can talk about sort of what's the right vehicle for us or the right kind of governance structure for us. Ultimately, all of these terminologies, all of these ideas here are getting at this idea of setting aside funds that we don't really touch and we sort of see as sort of capital that is there for us if we need it for either times when things go hairy and we need sort of that something to draw down on as an organization, or right that we're just thinking about our change needs as an organization. And so what do we sort of build for the future for our organization? So first is to just talk about this idea of operating reserves versus we often hear from organizations something like, my board wants us to set up an endowment. And that's when my sort of red flags and my lights go off as a board member or as a consultant to say, whoa, let's pump the brakes and understand what we're talking about here. So operating reserves are really, it's taking a look at our balance sheet where we should have unrestricted net assets listed or net assets without donor restrictions. And we'll look at this in a moment. And understanding what is available for use, right? So what's totally flexible for us to sustain financial operations if something were to happen, right? We have suddenly unanticipated budget increases or suddenly operating expenses are higher than we thought. Right? What do we have as sort of unexpected needs? We have operating reserves to help us get through and navigate that sort of period of an either unexpected expenses or unexpected loss in revenue. And so really it's thinking about this as like an emergency cushion, similar to in personal finance, right? You would think about what do I want to have as my sort of emergency cushion as a person? If I own a house, right, I want to think about What are the things that I might need for my house if something were to happen? What does that look like, right? And so we'll be sort of talking about it in similar terms today of how do you think about what do you need for that operating reserve? We may also see something that is sometimes called board designated funds, board designated special purpose, reserve funds. And this is when our board takes a chunk of our unrestricted net assets and says, we're designating this for a specific purpose. That could be a programmatic purpose. That could be we're setting aside $100,000 for this program that, it's really important for us to sort of grow a base because we want to cover, say, tuition costs for certain, groups of kids. And so this is really important for us. So we're going to have a special purpose fund for this use. We often see this come into play with fixed assets. So if we own a building, right, if we own our own theater space, right, we may have sort of a special purpose fund or reserve fund that is just to support sort of the fixed asset maintenance costs that are related to that building. And so this is really, again, it is the board designating those funds. It's not a donor. So the board is saying, here's our unrestricted funds. We're setting aside a certain chunk of these, and it's up to us as the board to undesignate them or, think about how we're going to maintain them. So operating reserves, just to recap, are really about sort of our flexible needs as an organization. We use them to, make sure that business can continue as usual in the case of unexpected circumstances, whereas our board designated special purpose funds have sort of a special use case that are related to them. Other terminology that's related here are quasi-endowments and then true endowments. So quasi-endowments are similar to those sort of board-designated special purpose funds. They're still, at the end of the day, just reserves. They're a chunk of reserves that our board has set aside and said, you know what, we're not ready. We don't have sort of the donor restrictions of a true endowment, and I'll talk about that in a second. But we want to set aside some funds where we're really not going to plan to tap those. We want them to really grow. And so we're going to treat them almost like an endowment. And the idea of an endowment is that we're investing the principal, or sometimes called the corpus, and we want that to stay intact, right? We don't want to draw down from the majority of those funds. And we just want to use the income that we get from those investments. Usually, sometimes that income is around 6-7%, something like that. And that allows us to really grow this base of funds for perpetuity so that we can get that income from it. For this strategy to be successful, we're talking about a pretty high number, right? If we're talking about just taking 6-7% off the top of what is invested, that's not a lot of, that's not a high percentage. So you want that principal or corpus to be substantial enough where that's really going to generate returns for you. And sometimes they see organizations where when they initially set up a quasi-endowment, they're doing it in a way where they don't actually take any income for, many years, and they just want to see that grow. But the idea is that we're growing this base from which to generate income. Endowments operate the same way, a true endowment is, but the difference here is that donors have imposed the restriction on what the funds can be used for. So this is where when you hear in the news, about like university endowments, things like this, these are true endowments where donors have restricted the funds for the purpose of an endowment. And that means that the board doesn't have control over how we can treat those funds. So for a quasi-endowment, it is technically still a board designated reserve. So the board can say at any point, you know what, circumstances have changed. We need to undesignate this, and we're going to change the sort of structure of how we set it up. We had said that we wanted the corpus invested. We just wanted to use the returns. Well, circumstances have changed, and we now need to access these funds. And so the board can take that action. With a true endowment, your donors have imposed this restriction. And so you need to get permission from the donor to change what that is going to be used for. And so this is an important distinction that I try to bring up. Remember when I said I was concerned about those red flags with board members, right? When they start talking about a true endowment, I want to say, hold up. Are we talking about a quasi endowment or are we talking about a true endowment? Because we have seen a lot of organizations run into problems where they have donor restricted funds for an endowment. And let's say the donor has passed away now, whatever circumstances have changed, and they now want to tap into those funds, right? They don't want to just use the returns off of them, and they feel like they have these funds, but they're really locked up and they can't tap into them. You're not going to be able to do that without permission from the donors explicitly stating that. So that can get very complicated. And so we really caution around setting up true endowments, and just encourage your board to sort of learn this terminology and think through, what are the goals? Are we talking about we want to have an endowment because we want to have operating reserves? Are we talking about having an endowment because we want to sort of grow a base of funds, from which we can generate income? Right? I think really driving at sort of what are the goals we're talking about and what are the strategies we're using. There's a lot of technical terminology to lay out early on. So please do put questions in the chat. We're going to dig more into sort of like, okay, that's all fine and dandy, but how do we just focus on the operating reserve side? That's our assumption, is that most of you would sort of start there, right? We want to start from just building that piggy bank, our emergency fund, whatever that is. And some of this more complex stuff could come later. But if you are an organization, and I've actually seen a lot of organizations where they have small endowments that have been set up, or quasi endowments, special purpose funds, and you have questions about that, please do throw them in the chat and we will get to them.
Thanks, Flannery. So there is a question in the chat right now. One feels like it might be helpful to respond to it.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, yeah. Do you want me to take it? You want to take it?
Feel free.
Okay, so the question from Sarah is, can you speak to operating reserve needs specific to organizations embarking on a capital campaign? Are more reserves needed? What are the specific considerations organizations should have in mind as they weigh entering a campaign with regard to reserves? This is an awesome question, and something that we do see get folded into capital campaigns. So I have seen some organizations use their capital campaigns as an opportunity to raise funds for a reserve. What I would just be careful around in your language is to not make it sound like you're raising funds for an endowment, right? So you just have to make sure that the language isn't, this is going to be restricted to our blank endowment or something like that. You're raising unrestricted funds, but you're sort of saying that this is an opportunity as an organization for us to raise capital that is going to be flexible and help our sustainability, our future as an organization. Can be a really effective way to build that initial base for operating reserves. So what I would suggest to an organization is to think about, what are our capital campaign goals, right? There could be other context aspects that I'm missing for that organization, right? Maybe they really need to do a big renovation on a building, right? Maybe we have a program that we really want to sort of pilot, and so it's important for us to raise the initial funds for that because we haven't gotten donors interested. Whatever that may be, I think there's that sort of strategic alignment about how we want to, drive that capital campaign. But I'm all for using that, a capital campaign energy to build operating reserves. And Katrina will talk in a little bit about, or I think I will maybe later, about sort of what are some of the strategies that we will use to really drive building those operating reserves, especially if we're not at the sort of level of operating reserves that we want. So hopefully that was helpful.
Flannery. Okay, so let me just share my screen. And similar, Flannery, if you're seeing the right screen, just quick thumbs up. Great. So, Flannery went through the terminology and kind of set us up to start understanding how we want to think about operating reserves. And so the question now comes around to how much reserve do we need? So what might be an appropriate threshold to have aside for that rainy day fund, or what might you need for future strategic endeavors your organization is thinking about? Also considering what is the organization capable of, right? And does the organizational financial health lend itself to the ability to build a reserve in the first place? So in this next section, we'll talk through some of these key concepts to help you answer some of those questions. But first, we just want to do a quick poll. Does your organization have a set goal, whether it be in dollars or months, for how much to have in an operating reserve? So I think Jess will launch the poll to everyone, and we'll just give everyone a few moments to respond. So the responses are, we don't have a goal. We're in the process of identifying our goal. We have an established goal, but are not able to achieve it, or we have an established goal and are able to regularly meet it. So again, we'll just give everyone a moment to respond. So Jess, how are we looking in terms of the response rates so far?
Got about 60% of folks responded. Maybe we'll give it another couple seconds, and
Great.
then I'll publish the results.
Sounds good. Great. So at least half of the people that respond say that they're in the process of identifying our goal, right? So, which makes sense, which is why we're all here, right? We're thinking about that goal. We want to understand how do we start establishing that process. And others, 5 responded, we have an established goal, but are not able to achieve it. A challenge that a lot of organizations are faced with, right? They want to aspire to have an operating reserves, but what are the approaches and practices that are going to be helpful to get you there? And then there are a couple that say that you have already an established goal and are able to regularly meet this. So a lot of the content that we're going through will likely reinforce some of the practices you have, but hopefully you'll also learn something new. So just thinking about the overall landscape of organizations that are able to develop a reserve, for a lot of them, thinking through a reserve is just not feasible right now. And fortunately for this group, it seems there are some that are in that position to be able to think about it. What we learned, at least with a lot of arts organizations, is that many of the organizations had that ability that actually came from COVID relief funding or response funding to start building that, through the generosity of programs and their donors and funders. So really excited to know that a lot of you are actually in the process of thinking about that. So we come back to this question around how much do we need in reserve? And that really all depends on 2 factors from our perspective, right? Which are your revenue risk factors and your spending risk factors. And this really speaks to the concept of the nonprofit business model, which Flannery will speak to in a little bit. But we're basically thinking through what risks do we bring through the types of revenue we generate, right? And what are implications for the expenses and financial obligations we have that might play a role in how much we need in a reserve? So, thinking through, does your revenue lend itself to that level of flexibility to be allocated to a reserve? Or how much of our revenue is unrestricted versus restricted, right? Do we get general operating support that will allow us to start contributing to it? Or do we find that majority of our revenue comes from perhaps government funding, from project restricted funding, right? So these are the things that we want to consider. And then in terms of expenses, thinking through how much our expenses are throughout the year or maybe from month to month, right? So you may want to consider these factors because that will really inform how much you might need to put aside to ensure your expenses are covered. right? Are there financial obligations you need to meet, or a certain level of expenses that need to be covered over a period of time? Or maybe there are strategic activities that leadership is planning for. So we want to make sure that we understand the right balance between these two risk factors to start assessing whether or how much of the reserves we can start building. And so, one starting place to start assessing that level of reserves is by looking at the statement of financial position, or also known as your balance sheet. So, really, this is a picture of your overall financial health at a point in time. So you'll see that it shows our assets, which is what we own. And some examples of this are cash you have, any receivables or investments you have, and any fixed assets you own that may be depreciating, like land, buildings, equipment, etc. And then there will be a section on liabilities, which includes what is owed by the organization. So, are there any bills to pay, right? Are there vendors you owe money to? So, really thinking about all of the payables of the organization, and then thinking through what other financing might you have. So, things like a line of credit or any debt, that's also going to sit in as a liability. And really, any other debt you may have, both short term and long term, would fit into the liability section as well. And then when you do the math of what is owned, less anything that is owed, you then have your net assets. So it's your it's your assets minus your liabilities to get your net worth for your organization. And then you'll see here that your net assets should be broken down between without donor restrictions and with donor restrictions. And so for the net assets without donor restrictions, that often includes those board designated funds that Flannery talked about, fixed assets, or anything else that would be unrestricted. While your with donor restrictions include temporarily and permanently restricted net assets. And so those net assets without donor restrictions are really critical in an organization's ability to build reserves because those assets are considered flexible resources. And this often comes in two types, right? So it's the unrestricted net assets that are readily available or can be easily converted to cash, which you can then put aside into either that operating reserve or the board designated reserves. And then we have equity in fixed assets, which can be things like your property, your buildings, your land, or equipment. So really thinking through those illiquid unrestricted net assets, which we'll go through in the next few slides. And so we talk about this idea of unrestricted net assets. And so we really want to spend time on this idea of liquid unrestricted net assets, or what we like to call LUNA, when we talk about operating reserves. And really, it starts with our unrestricted net assets, or net assets without donor restrictions that we found from the balance sheet, minus any of those illiquid net assets, which again is typically your fixed assets or things that you can't necessarily convert to cash quickly. So again, things like your building, any property, land, or equipment. And so while these illiquid net assets provide assets to your balance sheet, they're not easily converted to cash, and you'll want to back them out along with any debt associated with those fixed assets. So debt like mortgages or loans. And then when you do the math here, then it'll give you that true number of total liquid unrestricted net assets, which is a metric that we think is really important for organizations to look at when building financial health, right? It really tells us what level of available resources, perhaps funding, do we have to be nimble, to be flexible, to adapt for any uncertainty or expected challenges that we might be facing looking towards the future, right? And so this really plays a role in that idea of financially resilient organizations that Flannery mentioned before. We're able to think through what are our future long-term goals while being responsive to what's happening now. And your Luna will be able to assess how you can weather those challenges. But the figure around Luna is only part of the picture because we also want to think about it in terms of months of Luna. And so we have the math here to say you get months of Luna by calculating what your average monthly expenses are. And we say average because we acknowledge throughout the year there may be ebbs and flows of your expenses. You might have a high season of pushing out some expenses and paying those out, while you may have other months or quarters where it's a little bit of a lull, maybe a little slower. But we want to think of this as your average monthly expenses. And then you'll take your total Luna, right, that calculation that we have before and from the previous slide, and divide that by your your average monthly expenses to get that months of Luna. And really, when you're able to calculate the months of Luna, it tells you how many months of operating expenses that you can cover with your current liquid assets. So that feels like a lot, right? So we're really thinking about what does our balance sheet tell us in terms of what flexible resources are available? How much do we expend on a monthly basis throughout the year? And how do we calculate how much we might need to operate with the available resources that we have in that given time frame? Really thinking through essentially what is our runway should things change unexpectedly and, for example, should funding stop in any given moment? What does our financial health look like for that moment? And so we get asked this question a lot, but we'll put it to everyone here, thinking how many months of Luna, from your perspective, do you think a healthy organization should have? So we'll give folks a moment to enter it into the chat. So the question is, how many months of Luna do you think a healthy organization should have? And there's no right or wrong answer, so feel free to throw out a figure into the chat. I'm seeing a couple of responses around 6 months, a year, 6 months. Maybe that feels precarious. Yep. 24 months. I see 6 to 8 months. Give everyone just another moment. 12 months, 1 year. So these are all really great responses. And I think what this is telling me is that many of you are really thinking very long term, right? Really thinking through how do we remain financially viable, thinking through the long term of what might we need to continue operating. And so the answer that we often like to give is it depends, right? So it's kind of an answer, non-answer, but it really does depend. And if we want to hone in on a specific figure, generally 3 to 6 months is a best practice. But again, it really does depend on the organization and what you need. And so often we like to speak to what one of our principals who shares that it really is a number that from an executive director's perspective, from leadership's perspective, what is a number that's going to help you sleep at night? So if that means 12 months of Luna is going to help you sleep at night, then that's the figure or that's the benchmark that your organization will need and use as kind of that North Star. So while 3 to 6 months is a good practice, again, you'll really want to sit with your own leadership team and think about what makes sense for the organization because it's really going to be different for everyone. Yes, certainly I'm seeing this last comment, especially after COVID. I think COVID and any of the crises we've gone through, economic crises, health crises we've gone through, has really taught us a lot about what it means to be ready for the unexpected. And not to be all doom and gloom, but we can only imagine that this is not going to be the last crisis we go through. And certainly as we enter into an election year, there's a lot of uncertainty that we're facing, particularly because the art sector is always in a precarious position. So how do we really plan for any of the unexpected and expected changes that are going to be coming at us in these next few months, and how it's going to really inform the rest of the next 4, 5, 10 years. So thanks to everyone for responding to that question, which really brings us to this idea of capital. Capital for change and security. It's really thinking through the different types of capital that's going to bring us to a position of financial health. And it also is a planning mechanism, right? So the first type of capital is, again, operating reserves, which means you have some money on hand that is liquid and can be security for when things may not be going as planned. So it's, again, your runway for solving problems and can allow you to be more responsive to current needs. Again, bringing it back to that financially resilient organizations framework. Another type of capital can be for facilities, right? So there are a lot of organizations that either own property or manage the maintenance of property. Maybe you're thinking about acquiring a building. So you may want to consider a facility reserve, which is used for maintaining and replacing facilities. So if you have fixed assets like property and equipment, those things are depreciating, right? So you'll have to engage with more long-term planning for those assets, because as things depreciate, you'll need to think about when might we need to repair those items or replace a particular asset, and what is the time frame we're going to be needing to do that. So I believe it was Sarah who entered into the chat a capital campaign. Oftentimes those capital campaigns can be for buildings. And when you think about the reserve and how you're framing the additional need for that level of flexible funding, certainly facilities management is going to play a role in that. So thinking about in the future, what are the implications of acquiring this piece of property or building? How do we ensure we're maintaining it? And what do we need to build in order to effectively do that in the long term? You also have change capital, right? So this is the type of capital that's really exciting when you can actually start building it for innovation or growth or expanding programs. Maybe as an organization, you'll want to test new strategies or even reach new communities, right? So it really goes beyond just solving the immediate current needs and challenges, and is another type of capital that we're thinking about when looking at our balance sheet for the long term and our long-term financial health and sustainability. So this is the type of change where, or capital, I should say, where you're able to think strategically about making those changes that are intentional, that are really going to push your mission forward and maybe allow a level of innovation to adapt and be more responsive to the communities you're serving, while also tying it to the values that you have as an organization and that vision. And then finally, you have an endowment. And then this is a way, if large enough, an organization can really have that base to generate revenue in perpetuity and help cover the costs of operations and maybe any strategic moves you might be considering. So again, as Flannery mentioned, a true endowment really kind of locks in that principle or that corpus, but any interest or returns that are made on that endowment can certainly help an organization's operations and really fund the work that it needs to do on a daily basis. So again, acknowledging that we went through a lot, we're going to pause here to see if there are any questions that have been coming up for the group so far. All right. So it's not the only chance you'll be able to ask any questions, so feel free to enter anything into the Q&A or in the chat that might be coming up for you.
Great. Thank you, Katrina. So I wanted to sort of just level set of where we were with that first poll of thinking about what are sort of our goals. Oh, I just see there's the Q&A. Let's see. Do you have any particular resources you can suggest on educating boards on these principles? I would say we're going to share, this is being recorded and I think will be available on YouTube. So I think that's the first one. We also have some resources, articles and stuff that we're going to list at the end. And then if we have time, I'm going to do a walkthrough of this toolkit that we have for creating board approved policies around operating reserves. So we will talk through that. But hopefully between those resources, that's a good place to get started. And then Alejandro says, most of our funds in our organization are restricted. Any ideas on how to further develop unrestricted funds for operating reserves? Yeah, I mean, this is sort of the easier said than done question, Alejandro. Like I can't fix the sector, but I hear you, right? Because this is the challenge. And this is partly what I wanted to do a little level setting of this is all fine and dandy to talk about when you have already, squirreled away a decent chunk of those unrestricted net assets that are liquid that Katrina mentioned. If we're in a position where we're raising mostly restricted funds, we're not going to be able to do that. And that's where I wanted to start from, which is just what gets us to build that Luna balance. And ultimately, we are only going to be able to build Luna if we bring in more unrestricted revenue than we have expenses. That's our surplus. That surplus adds to our base of Luna and gets us to grow our Luna over time. And this is the easier said than done thing, right? I can tell you that from a financial and accounting rules perspective, that this is how you build Luna. That is not me going out in the field and getting you unrestricted dollars from funders, which we all know is incredibly challenging to do. And it's often much easier to raise restricted funds. So, the capital campaign strategies make me excited. Finding those funders that we know, always just taking the time to ask to see, it never hurts to see what we can convert from restricted to unrestricted. But again, of course, I recognize this is not an easy thing to do, to bring in unrestricted dollars, but it is a reason to think about, when we look at our revenue mix, right? To think about individuals, to think about, funders who may be more flexible, and to really, advocate for our needs there, or at least advocate for indirect rates that help us, offset the operating expenses that we have. So this wanted to just name that everything we've talked about is sort of built on this assumption that we have an ending Luna balance that meets our goals. And so building this as a practice to how do we generate these surpluses over time is really, really critical to this conversation. And if you are in that bucket of folks who are saying, we have a goal, we're struggling to get there, I hear you. I was just having a conversation with, I'm on the board of an organization and we are looking at a deficit budget this year. And I'm the treasurer. I was having tough conversations with the executive director about how much of a deficit are we comfortable with. And some of that came down to how much are we willing to tap into our reserves and our Luna balance, that in a way that feels comfortable. And those aren't easy decisions to make. That's the tough work that we do in this space in the sector. But just to name that, this doesn't just sort of automatically happen overnight, and building a Luna balance can take many, many years to get to the goals that we have. And if we have new sort of strategic priorities, we're getting a building, we have new programs, that becomes harder, and we have to loop that into our goal setting, and make sure that we're really driving towards those updated goals. Okay. Thanks, Alejandro. You got me ranting about the sector. So in terms of ways that we can create reserves, again, it really takes sort of a bit of discipline to say, we have this goal, we want to work towards it. and really thinking about sort of balancing priorities as part of that. In terms of the actual ways that we can contribute to that as part of a surplus, we can do that in different ways. Sometimes organizations will just say, we're going to run the budget, and whatever surplus we have at the end of the year, we'll allocate that to our reserve. Other organizations will say, we want to make sure that we're really raising these dollars. So even though it's not an operating expense, we're going to include a line in the budget, sometimes it's sort of a below the line part of the budget, that says we're going to, add $100,000 to our reserves this year. That means that we then have to go fundraise that $100,000, right? So we're intentionally saying we're putting this in the budget. We're going to go out and raise this. And so that is a good way to sort of build it in if you're sort of in this space of we're never able to sort of meet this goal, is, well, how can we sort of build that into our fundraising goals and plans for the year? Again, that's a decision. You're saying we want to go out and raise for our reserves versus we're going to raise for our programs. So I'm not saying that's easy to do, but it is a way to sort of build that discipline and practice to really help us achieve those longer term financial goals that we have. Other places that we see opportunities to think about building your reserves, one, capital campaigns isn't explicitly on here, but I would sort of put that in the unexpected gifts and bequests bucket. Really, right, we're saying that if we get a one-time really big gift from a funder, we're going to set a large part of that into our reserve. We love that as a strategy. It feels like a real opportunity when those special grants come into play. And then bequests can also be something, right? When those do land, we could have sort of an internal policy that we designate those bequests to support our reserves. And then targeted foundation investments. So I wouldn't say this is like an across the board, all funders are doing this strategy, but we are seeing some funders who are open and excited to help organizations invest in their reserves. So it is worth having a conversation, again, going back to the idea of telling your financial story, being able to tell your funders, this is a goal we're working towards. We're struggling to meet it. What's your approach and thinking behind reserves, right? Is that something that you would ever think about? I just encourage you to have those conversations. All right. I see a question, which is, where does grants seat in all of this? Trina, do you have a sense of what that might mean? Or Jess?
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure. I'm wondering if it's part of, the thinking through revenue that organizations generate, and how that plays a role in creating reserves, but any clarity from say that would be really helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'll say generally, going back to the previous slide, grants fit into this in that you're going to generate revenue as an organization. Some of your grant revenue may be restricted purpose or time restricted, and some of it may be unrestricted. And so when we think about your surplus deficit, the amount that sort of goes to your Luna balance is driven by what's unrestricted or released for the year, but net against your expenses. So if I have an unrestricted grant that we get, anything from that could go into our reserve, but of course it's going to be net against our expenses. And then for restricted purpose grants, we know that those are really tied to the expenses. So you're not likely to use revenue from that to really build your Luna balance. Your unrestricted grants are going to be a bigger driver of what might help you build your Luna balance. Does that help? Okay. All right, so we have another poll we'd love your perspective on, which is we've talked about sort of the conceptually what are operating reserves, right? What are our goals? And then another question is, do we want to have policy that helps sort of our board and us as an organization manage and ensure that we're really setting up our operating reserves in a way where we're really governing them. So our question is, do you have a board policy around managing your reserves? So we will look at the results of that in a moment. Okay. So we got a nice distribution here. Some folks do not have a board policy at this point. Some folks are sort of in the process of creating one, which great that you're here. We can sort of talk through what that could look like. We have a policy, not necessarily board approved, and then some folks do have a board policy. And so this is one of the many decision points that you will have around operating reserves. Sometimes we get the question of, what's the difference between a Luna balance and an operating reserve? And so your Luna balance is ultimately all of those flexible, unrestricted, liquid dollars that you have. And there's a decision that your board can make, which is, do we want to create a bit more structure around this so that we know that we are meeting our goal, we're reviewing it on a regular basis, and we're adding a little bit of red tape around it so that the board has oversight and can manage and say, when can we and can we not tap this? Again, that's a decision. And how much you decide to sort of put in that bucket of what's managed with that board policy versus what you might just want to have liquid and available so that you can operate easily, those may be two different questions, right? And so that's, again, sort of adds a layer of nuance to this that can be complicated, but it's important to keep in mind. So I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of the board policy side of it, but I would say if you're at the very beginning stages of thinking about this, I would prioritize just building up our Luna balance and focusing on that first. Once you have a Luna balance that you feel comfortable with, that's when I would start to think about the governance policy around it, right? Are we at that stage where we can think about creating some structure and policy around this so that we really are ensuring that we're managing this for the long term? So your board of directors, as strong fiduciaries, should, as part of that responsibility, really understand your organization's business model, and they should understand the risks associated with it. So when Katrina was talking about sort of those spending and revenue risks that inform how much Luna or reserves we should have, your board should really get that, right? They should understand, do we have grants or contracts that are slow to pay? And so we need to make sure we have extra liquidity to cover those sort of cash crunches that naturally happen. Are we an organization that spends a lot more over the summer when we have certain summer programming? And so it's important that we have a higher, balance in the summer versus the winter, right? What are sort of those business model vulnerabilities and strengths that are going to inform that? Your board should really have that clarity and line of sight into it. You also really want your board to be thinking with you about that sort of long-term sustainability and not just sort of year-to-year results, right? We don't want our board just sort of like laser focused on individual line items in our budget. We want our board helping to help us think about, all right, we're planning to buy a building in 2 years. What do we need to be planning for, right? What does that mean in terms of the reserves that we're going to need to maintain the building? What are all the big things that are coming up long term, just as an example. And then if any of our reserves are going to be invested, your board are the ones who should be thinking with you about your risk tolerance for those investments and creating a policy for those investments. Even if it's as simple as we're going to invest in some CDs and fixed income securities at super low risk. We want that documented in a policy. Your board, hopefully it's a finance committee, is involved in that in really setting that policy with you, because they should be thinking about it again at that sort of highest risk level. And then the board, in terms of operating reserves, has this opportunity to think with you about, where is policy going to be helpful for us? and sort of what will that look like. So we're going to share this tool today, which is a policy guide if you're thinking about building an operating reserve policy. And the board should be involved in that with you as staff to think about how that can be structured. So if we are going to create a policy, some of the big questions we need to think about are, when do we use our reserves? This might feel like an obvious one, but when you sit down and think about it, it may be less so. So I mentioned before the organization that I'm on the board of, right? We have this question of, do we want to use our reserves to cover a deficit? That's a decision, right? We need to think about that. And if we feel comfortable with it, or do we use our reserves for short-term cash coverage, right? Is it, when that contract that we have, we know is always going to be delayed for payment, and so we borrow from the reserves temporarily, and then we pay it back, right? What are the appropriate uses of it? And how do we determine that, right? We need to sort of put that into the policy. What's the goal balance for our policy, right? Is it a certain number of months of expenses? And then how do we make sure that if we're a growing organization and it's based on months of expenses, that we're contributing to it over time so that it keeps pace, right? Because the balance that we had 2 years ago is not going to keep up with a growing organization. How do we deal with these sort of surpluses or shortfalls, right? What's sort of the response to that? Do we make sure that next year's budget includes a replenishment line if we have to draw down from it this year? How does that work? Again, how do we sort of build the reserve to keep pace with the organization? And then what's our sort of process for reviewing this policy on a regular basis? How do we integrate that regularly and either into the work of the finance committee, executive committee, whoever it may be? So this is where I say, start with raising your Luna, right? Get to that place where you have the Luna, because at the end of the day, you still need just regular liquidity, right? If you think about that graphic that Katrina shared with the capital for change and security, Luna, first and foremost, needs to be there for liquidity. And then we may decide that we want to set some of it up so that it's a little bit more behind red tape for security, right? We're saying we want to sort of put some more structure around this so that we know it's there and it's not just sort of what we use for regular bill pay and things like that. And we want our board involved in that decision making. So that's where you really need to work with your board is, what's that Luna that's just available? How much do we want to put in behind a true board designated operating reserve, right? How does that look? And then looking at those policies. So the next steps, right, would be to sort of fund what that operating reserve is going to look like, right? To establish what's that base we're going to set aside. And then we don't have this here, but I always say, if we're setting aside a nice chunk of change, we should be putting it in some sort of investment vehicle, even if it's just a very low risk, high yield savings, like something that is earning interest if we're not going to be tapping into it. So I would think about that with your board, and then create a board resolution to establish it, and then create that policy. And then we sort of get to the stage of really thinking about managing our fund, right? So that's, thinking about the day-to-day management of it, borrowing from it, paying it back, right? Who do we work with on the finance committee or on our board to support us with that? And following the policy, updating the policy, all of those things. So those are sort of the logistics of getting to this place of establishing a formal reserve policy. The guide that I will share in a moment is more on the operating reserve focus side, but you could follow a similar path for the different types of special reserve funds that we talked about today too. So if you are thinking about setting up a fixed asset reserve, a building reserve, something like that for your facilities, you could follow a similar sort of approach, right? Thinking about all of these questions here of, what do we use this reserve for, right? What are appropriate costs that this can be used for? How do we replenish it? How do we decide how much should be in it? all of those things could go in a similar policy for those special use funds. And again, part of that is also going to talk to what are the protocols for when we need to borrow from it? Do I need to get just my finance committee to approve that? Do we need to go to the full board, right? These are all the sort of things that you would need to dig into.
So I think we might have a glitch on Flannery's end. So let's just continue pushing on around just seeing if she's still
I'm
here.
here. Did you
Okay,
lose me? Can you hear
just
me again?
just for a little, we can hear you now.
Okay, where did it cut off?
You were still on the managing reserves, and I think you were talking to the last point still.
Okay, did I talk about facility? Did you hear me talk about facility reserves, or did that get cut off?
I didn't hear that.
Okay, all right. So what I was saying was that we can follow these same steps for our special reserve funds in the same way that we would for operating reserves. So I'm going to share this toolkit that we have in a moment, and it's really focused on creating a board designated operating reserve, but you can follow these same protocols for your special purpose funds. So if you're establishing a facilities reserve, you want to go through and ask the same questions, right? How much do we want to have in our facilities reserve? How do we replenish it? How do we tap into it? What are the approvals we need to access it? And so as an executive director, as a leader, you want to be thinking about what's the right appropriate sort of levels of board approvals there that make this accessible, but also add that layer of oversight and control over it. And then the same thing for if you were setting up a quasi endowment, you could do the same thing there too. All right, I'm gonna see, please put thoughts and questions in the chat or in the Q&A thing. And I'm gonna share my screen, different screens so you can see this toolkit if this is useful to you to check out later. Zoom out. So this will be linked in our resources that I'll walk through in a moment. I put this together, so I'm always excited to share it. It is kind of a setup, almost like a Mad Libs, but it's meant to sort of walk you through the different places of what your template might look like. So it sort of gives you a sample template, and the blue text is the places that we want you to sort of customize it. So you'll see it starts with sort of what the purpose of this is, right? Where you need to think through sort of the objectives for your fund. It gets you to then think about your goals, right? Sort of how do we determine sort of what the number of months is that we want to have based on our sort of calculation of operating expenses. It talks about how we're going to fund the reserve over time, right? Have we already met our goal and we're just designating a Luna balance, or do we need to start, thinking about raising those dollars? How do we sort of replenish and build that over time? Talks about our investments a little bit. It talks about if our reserve isn't meeting our target, how we might approach that, accounting, use, and then sort of how the board is tapped to authorize sort of tapping in how we access those reserves on a regular basis to have those strong internal controls, and then our review of the policy. And so then there's some extra guidance here about everything from how do we think about setting the goals, assessing our risk factors, as Katrina talked about, and then other things in here as well to help you think about, again, just the management of these reserves. So definitely check out this tool. Should be a helpful place to look and reference if you are thinking about building out your policies. All right, so any additional questions coming up? Yeah, we aim to be in depth. Like we did go pretty deep on operating reserves today. That was the goal. Hopefully you are demystified and not more mystified by the end of this.
Awesome. Well, I want to just, make some room for potential other questions to come in. I know there's going to be some resources that our BDO folks are going to share, and I'll share as well about some Art Science resources, but just a reminder that all of this is recorded and will be available on the Arts Alliance YouTube page. I see a couple actually questions that have just come in. Maybe you
Yeah,
want to start with the anonymous and then get to Jacqueline's question in the chat.
Yeah, that sounds great. So in the hypothetical situation where an organization you're supporting is taking what you think are too many risks with their operating reserves, can you suggest any conservative ways to raise red flags without shutting people down, asking for a friend? So I hear you on this question. I think generally the way I would view operating reserves is that we want to see them growing. And so if I see that they are, decreasing over time, that would be a concern, right? So if it's sort of up and down, and then we maybe borrow from it during the year and then we replenish it, then I think that's okay. But the idea of operating reserves is not that this is just sort of a place that we borrow from in a moment of crisis and then we don't pay back, right? That would be sort of a concern to me. And then we're not really sort of thinking about long term, we're thinking just about short term. That doesn't mean that we can't tap them and give and then replenish them, right? So I think that's the dynamic, is when it feels like permanent drawdowns versus we're borrowing from it and then paying it back with a plan. That's when I think there's sort of a shift for me in the dynamic. So that would be what I would try to drive at, is, are we just responding to what I would call a structural deficit, right? Where we don't have revenue that is higher than our expenses, and that's the case for a while, and we're just spending down our reserves. That to me is, we need to face facts and address our business model sustainability, versus during the year, we have a lot of things that come up and we have to borrow from it, but we always have a plan on how to give it back. So hopefully that helps. You talked a little bit about dipping into reserves to cover deficit. What is an acceptable deficit to plan for? That is not a question that I can answer sort of with a here's the acceptable deficit. That really, really depends on the organization and what is driving the deficit that year. To me, I worry when we have 2 years of deficits, right? If there's sort of as a board member, I would say I have approved deficit budgets before, when I sort of see what's driving it, and also it's based on where are we with the reserves that we have. But what worries me is, again, what I would call that structural deficit, which is more than a year where we have a deficit. And that to me speaks to, we need to address a sustainability concern in our organization. So to me, it sort of speaks to, is this something that we think is a one-off year and we have a plan for how to fix it next year? Or is this, we haven't sort of faced facts about how our organization can operate sustainably, and we need to, think about a restructure. So no hard and fast rules there, unfortunately, Jacqueline. Yeah. All right, let me walk through resources, and then if more questions pop up, I will come back to them. So this is the toolkit that we walked through just now. And then a few other articles that you might want to check out here. Keeping It in Reserves, written by Hilda Polanco, who's our managing principal. So great sort of primer if you're starting to have conversations with your board. I would check out that article. Likewise, the sort of primer about Luna article below, which is now 2012. That's an oldie at this point, but still very relevant. And then the sustainability mindset, I think you can find separately. And then this article about sort of how to think about capital is an interesting one, so check that out too. And then we maintain a really great library of open source resources and tools on a site that we work with the Wallace Foundation on. You can find it by typing strongnonprofits.org into a URL browser, and there's all kinds of things. The reserve policy toolkit is on there, as well as lots of other tools and resources around financial management. There are also some great videos walking through some of those tools, so definitely recommend that you check that out. You can see the different sort of headers of categories of stuff that we have on there. All right. I'm not seeing any other questions, but we've really appreciated being with you all here today. Again, I hope this was demystifying, as declared in the title. I know this stuff gets really technical and also really just complicated with balancing our organization's priorities and strategies. So there's really no straightforward answers here, but hope you all sort of take away that a lot of this is driven by your approach to risk. And as Katrina said, those numbers speak more to what will make your leadership sleep at night sometimes than they do sort of a hard and fast benchmark that we can provide you as external consultants. So lean into that. You know your organizations, you know the risks, and we're always here for any questions that come up. So thank you all for having us with you today.
Thank you so much, Flannery and Katrina. A couple quick wrap-up things before you all hop off. If you liked this program, if this panel, if you are holding on to some additional questions, we really want your feedback. So we would love to hear from you about what kind of future programming you would like, as well as how we can improve our help desk offering. So I dropped a link to a survey in the chat. I also want to make sure you all have the link to our YouTube channel just to make sure you can access the recording of this and other webinars coming up. That is going to be in the chat in just a moment. As we mentioned, the Alliance is a membership-driven organization. As I said, it's pay what you can. If you like this program, you're interested in getting more involved in advocating for the arts and culture sector in Illinois, we would love to have you as a member. So I'm going to drop a link to more information about Arts Alliance membership as well. And finally, to stay on top of all of our help desk offerings, make sure you subscribe to the Arts Alliance newsletter. We always have announcements about upcoming programs like this, other kinds of resources that are available through us and through other partners. So make sure you sign up for that if you haven't already to make sure you're in the loop. Otherwise, I hope to see you at a future help desk program or Arts Alliance event. Thank you all again for being here and have a wonderful rest of your Wednesday.